All right, hi everyone and welcome. Thanks for joining yet another presentation brought to you by the Mackinac Straits Raptor Watch. My name is Nick Aliotto and I'm presenting in association with the Michigan State Science Festival. And our presentation today is on hawk identification. So we're going to go over some of the standardized counts and research that Mackinac Straits Raptor Watch is doing for counting migratory hawks, and then we are going to look at a breakdown of the groups of hawks that can be seen and look at some specific species and learn how to ID them or get an introduction to make you guys hopefully learn something about hawk ID, and if you're a beginner, learn something, or even if you're a seasoned birder, maybe pick up some tips and tricks you didn't know before. So let's get started with this. So the first thing is, what makes northern Michigan a great spot to count diurnal raptors, and why is Mackinac Straits Raptor Watch conducting research up here? Well, the answer to that lies in the shape of the state. It's naturally shaped like a funnel, and we know from observations and studies that raptors are reluctant to cross large bodies of water. This is due to the fact that it's dangerous and costs a lot of energy. So what they do is they follow the landmass of Michigan here, the Lower Peninsula, and they follow that all the way till they get concentrated at the tip of the mitt, up in Mackinac City, which is where our spring count is conducted. So birds concentrate at the tip, and then they wait for the right conditions, and they cross the Straits into the UP. It's only a few miles, and it's a pretty quick hop before they hit land again, which is safe. And then once they cross from there, they can disperse to their breeding grounds in the UP or in Canada, or wherever they end up going. And that's also just like our other monitoring programs. When it comes to fall migration and the birds are heading south to their wintering grounds, our counters are based in St. Ignace, and they monitor hawks migrating over from St. Ignace, crossing back into the Lower Peninsula. So that's why northern Michigan is a great spot to count these migratory diurnal raptors. So a little bit more about the Raptor Watch location. So if we took that tip of the mitt and we zoomed in, right now, currently we started our spring hawk count on March 5th, and our counter is based out of Mackinac City. So there's two sites in Mackinac City they count out of. The first one is the rec center, which is in downtown, and it's advertised and there's signs. So you're actually able to go and visit these sites if you want to see our counter and see the birds and see the awesome migration spot for yourself. And then the second site that is highlighted here is the Darrow site. So that's just the property that's owned by a company. And the reason we have these two sites is pretty much based on the wind. So the diurnal raptors rely on the correct wind to be able to cross. And depending on which way the wind is blowing on any respective day depends on where the counter will be situated, so they can get the best view of raptors. So these are our two spring sites, and I wanted to show these in case anybody ever comes up this area. They can come and visit, and they will be, our counters are there from March 5th, which was the start, until the first week of June, so there's a lot of time. A little bit more about the counting program. Mackinac Straits has been conducting standardized hawk counts since the 1990s, and that's right now holds the record for the most number of red-tailed hawks counted at any spring site in all of North America, and they also hold the record for most golden eagles seen in the spring site in North America, apart from seeing thousands of other raptors too. So just a really great spot, and we've since it's been going on since the 90s, we're starting to accumulate a really good long-term data set of all the species that use the Straits as a migratory corridor. So now let's get into some of the actual hawk IDing. So we know what makes Michigan a good spot to count raptors. I showed you guys the spots where we count. So what are we actually seeing? So there's three main groups of raptors that we typically observe, and that it's easy to break down by silhouettes. So the first is the falcons over here on the left. Falcons include your species like your American Kestrel, your Merlin, the peregrine falcon, gyr falcon, prairie falcon, and they're characterized by long pointed wings, a long tapered tail, a very strong rowing wing beats, and they're fast. And they're they're pretty commonly seen at our migration sites. The next one that you should be familiar with is the accipiters. These are forest-dwelling hawks. There's 3 species that are found across North America. You have your Sharpshin Hawk, Cooper's Hawk, and the northern goshawk. And accipiters, their silhouette, as you can see here, is defined by having round, short wings and a long tail. And this suits their lifestyle of hunting in forests, which we'll talk a little bit more when we look at a specific species and learning ID keys. And then if we move along, we get into the bootios. So these are things like your red-tailed hawk, broadwing hawk, rough-leg hawk, ferruginous hawk. And bootios are the most common hawk you're most likely going to see. And they're characterized by their really broad wings, short rounded tail, and you normally see them soaring. So they're one of the more easier raptors that you're going to see at the hawk count. So these are the 3 silhouettes you want to really try to remember when you're at a hawk site: is falcon, accipiter, buteo. But apart from those, there's also other raptors that are seen at the hawk count. So we see things like eagles. As I mentioned, this spring count site is really a high density golden eagle migration spot. So we get 2 species of eagle that move through here, the bald eagle, which is here on the left, and the golden eagle here on the right. And we're going to get into the more ID features for them later on. And then not to be excluded from raptors also include vultures. Even though they don't have a predatory lifestyle, they're considered raptors based on their ancestral heritage. So the main vulture we see here is the turkey vulture, which we also are going to talk about IDing in flight. And there's also the black vulture, which we're not going to really cover in this presentation, just because black vultures really have more of a central to southern state range. We get a few up here that kind of end up here, but this isn't their normal range. So for the sake of our site and where we are, we're not going to be touching on those guys today. So learning the craft of Hawk ID, I thought I would try to lay out some tips for ways to break it down. Hawk ID is difficult, and it takes, it's a lot of skill set, and it's sometimes hard to figure out where to have a starting point. So the keys to IDing raptors, I've broken it down to these 5. So 1, as we talked about, the outline or the shape or silhouette of the bird. A lot of time you're going to see these birds high up in the air flying, and with the contrast of the sky and the sun, you're just going to get a silhouette. So, learning the silhouettes and shapes really can help you not always narrow it down to the species, but at least to the group of birds you're seeing. And then the second point is the flight style. So all 3 of those groups of birds, they have a distinct flight style, which can help you pinpoint, once you figure out the group of raptor it is, then you can actually, sometimes narrow it down to the actual species just based on how it's flying. Number 3 is a plumage characteristics. So we're going to go over plumage characteristics for certain species from each of those groups, things to help you look for to be able to tell apart adults and young birds and subadults. So we're going to touch on that. The other keys to ID are behavior and habitat. So a lot of times you can rule birds out just based on where you're finding them and how they're acting. So those are good cues to pick up on too. And then number 5, which is the big one, is just practice. The more time you spend outdoors looking for hawks or at hawk sites or just observing, the more you're going to learn. And along with that, practice means taking notes and having guides, taking photos. And if you combine all 5 of these, you really can hone the craft of IDing hawks and become quite proficient. And so I included this little video, which is from our hawk site in Mackinac, from the count site. And I wanted to play a video just to show you what it looks like when there's a kettle of raptors flying around. So right now you might say, wow, that's a lot of birds. I'm not sure, it's just the silhouettes. But after this presentation, hopefully we'll be able to say, hey, those are all actually just turkey vultures kettling around. So, and a good thing about seeing a kettle like this is when you get those comparisons of birds side by side, that really can help you understanding and seeing the subtle differences, the flight styles, and all that. So that's another good reason to be at these flight sites, or these migration sites. And before we dive into the few species that I want to cover for IDing, before you start IDing birds in flight, it's good to know the actual anatomy of what you're looking at. If someone tries to describe a field mark or an area on the bird, it's good that you know what you're looking for. So I put together these two pictures just to kind of go over some of the basic anatomy. So this bird on the left is a red-tailed hawk. Some important features, anatomy parts that you should know are the undertail coverts. So those are just the feathers that are on the base of the tail right here. The belly, so similar to us, just the belly of the bird. The chest, so where the flight muscles and the breast muscles attach. The axillary feathers or the wing pits, so you can think of that kind of as our armpit or the wing pit of the bird, so the innermost part of the wing. And then we have the underwing coverts, so you have the flight feathers here, but then you have these coverts that cover up the bases of these feathers. So underwing coverts can sometimes, be a good ID key for some raptors. And then we go over here to this goshawk, northern goshawk, which is the biggest accipiter. I broke down just the flight feathers, or also known as the remiges, if you ever hear that fancy term. So there's the primaries, and all raptors have 10 primaries, and starting from the outside, is numbered from 10 to 1. And then there's secondaries, which is this inner block of feathers closest to the body. And then up here, I wanted to point out the carpal, which is the wrist, and that's a good ID feature for things like rough-leg hawks, which we're going to talk about shortly here. So that's just some basic anatomy for you. And it's a good thing to continue to get familiar with as you continue to hawk watch and ID birds. So the first species that I wanted to talk about IDing is the Sharpshin Hawk. The Sharpshin Hawk is a member of the accipiters. So if you remember, the accipiters have the rounded wings, short, narrow tails, and this suits their lifestyle to being ambush predators in the forest. The short tail and round wings, it allows them to maneuver really quickly, which suits their habitat. And as a whole, accipiters are the hardest groups of hawks to ID in flight. They all look very similar plumage-wise when they're young and adults. And they all have very similar behaviors in their flight styles. So with the Sharpshin Hawk, I figured this would be the best species to look at because it's the most common accipiter you're probably going to see. There's great migrations of them around the Great Lakes. So the Sharpshin Hawk is the smallest of the 3 species in North America. So there's the Sharpshin, the Coopers, and the northern goshawk. Northern goshawk is pretty uncommon, so I didn't figure we'd touch on that. So like I said, for Sharpshin Hawks, the keys for them are their short rounded wings, short square tail, as you can see here, and the small head. So when you see these guys, this one on the left here is a juvenile. It's characterized by young Sharpshins have brown vertical streaking on their breast and an overall brownish tone to them. Also, apart from having their short rounded wings and square tip tail, which is short, they also have stockier secondaries. So younger juvenile Sharpshin hawks, the secondaries are longer than adults over here, which are more evenly straight with the wing. Some other characteristics to decipher the young from the adults, when they molt into their adult plumage, adult Sharpshin hawks get this orange horizontal barring on the chest, which depending on the light can be very easy to see in good light conditions. Once again, you're going to see not as stocky secondaries, so they don't protrude out as far as the young brown here on the left. And same thing, if you see these guys, you're going to see their really small little head. And they also seem more compact, kind of like they're squished together. If you see a Cooper's hawk, which is usually what they get mis-ID'd for, Cooper's hawks are more streamlined. Their body's a lot thinner and they look more stretched out, and their wings appear to be longer too. And another good characteristic for identifying Sharpshin hawks is, and other accipiters, is their flap-flap glide pattern. And this isn't a tell-all for all accipiters, because a lot of hawks will exhibit a flap-flap glide pattern at some point, but these guys do it the most frequently, where they'll do a flap-flap and then glide, flap-flap and glide. And Sharpshin hawks, when you get practice seeing it, when they're doing their flap flop glide, they look very anxious or rust. It doesn't, or rush, not rust. So when you see them doing that, they it looks like they're trying. It just looks like an anxious movement. That's just a good characteristic. As for habitats, you're going to find them inhabiting woodlands and semi-open countries. So they, they're in the forest, but you'll see them outside hunting. They'll even sometimes beat your feeders, and they're pretty common at migration sites. You'll see them kettling up, rising on thermals, and they'll be sometimes mixed in with other species. So the key takeaways for these guys, for accipiters, are the rounded wings, the short square tail on these guys, the small head, kind of compact body. And then when you look at the juveniles, the vertical streaking on the breast, and the adults, they get the vertical orange barring, and then also on the top side, they're not brown, they're more of the slaty blue-gray color. And it also should be noted that with all raptors and hawks in general, females are always larger than the males. So sometimes if you get a comparison of them in the air, sometimes you can see subtle size differences. And females usually are about 25% larger than males, so it's quite a bit of range difference. And the next group that we want to talk about are the bootios. So based on their silhouettes, bootios are designed for soaring. They have big, broad, long wings and a short, rounded tail. And this really is optimal for soaring, which is usually what you see bootios doing. You see them soaring on warm air. They can catch warm drafts and just are built to soar around, and you see them circling. And some good characteristics for all bootios is they're generally dark on the top side of their body and they're lighter underneath. So you always have that contrast of having a dark top side and a lighter bottom. Some things about their flight, since they are bigger, usually their wing beats are more shallow, so they're not as deep as other birds, and they're more powerful and they seem more labored just because of how big they are. So the first bootio we want to look at is the red-tailed hawk. And I want to look at this bird because it is the most common bootio that you're going to see across North America. And they're also the most variably plumaged birds. So there's all sorts of different subspecies and morphs. So there's light morphs all the way to dark morphs, as you can see over here on the right, where it's completely brown except for its red tail. And some good ID keys for these guys. Obviously on the adults, you're going to see this nice rufous orange-red tail. The tail pattern colors can be highly variable in marking depending on the subspecies, but as soon as you see that red tail, boom, you know it's a red-tailed hawk. If you get good lighting, it's something that's very obvious. Some other good distinct features, you might remember the anatomy slide, the patagium, which is this dark spot up here on the leading, well, I guess close to the wing pit, and it kind of looks like where the bicep area would be on a bird. And on red tails, they always are going to have this dark patagium. That's a good ID key. So if you see that dark patagium, red tail, you know it's a red-tailed hawk. Apart from that, you're always going to see this kind of complete belly band going across them. That's highly variable, but it's also a good ID feature. As for location and finding them, you can find them almost anywhere in North America. They have, a wide range that stretches from coast to coast. Normally, you'll see them sometimes perched on telephone poles or off in fields in open areas, or if you see them flying, they're soaring. Like I said, all bootios are optimal soars. So you'll see them kind of lazily circling up, going around. And some other good ID keys for these guys, for the adults, is their stocky secondaries. So on young birds, this one over here, the juvenile red-tailed hawk, their primaries are longer. So you'll see, and they have a thinner subterminal band. So this dark band in the secondaries is a lot thinner as compared to adults. You'll tell if it's an adult because you'll see this dark band is a lot thicker. Also, another cool ID key on young red tails is their outer primary, so that outer hand of feathers, the 10 feathers. When they're flying, it actually appears like a translucent window. So if you see them underneath, it looks like the outer wing is pale compared to the rest of the wing. And that's a good ID feature for young bootios. And you also see that in some other species as well. And then for the tail, With red tails, with juveniles, the tail's actually longer than on adults. So when you see them side by side, sometimes you can just tell because the tail on a young bird is longer than an adult. The adult's tail is a lot shorter and rounder. And these guys can be tough though, just because of the plumage variation and all the different morphs. But if you can get a good look at the patagium, the tail, the belly band, usually you can narrow it down to being a red tail, and it's not more than likely going to be the most common boodio you're going to see. So this bird over here is kind of your typical northern subspecies, the albiticolas. The one here in the middle is an adult. It's kind of a very light morph. And then we move over, as I mentioned, we have this juvenile bird. So they have the longer secondaries. That subterminal band is a lot thinner as compared to here on the adults. And they have the longer tail, which isn't red, and it's brown with many bars going through it. And then you go something over here to this dark morph red tail. So really dark bird, but you see that rufous red tail. And right away, you can key it out as being a red-tailed hawk. So this is the most common boodio you're going to encounter. And then here's a video of just a red-tailed hawk at our migration site again. And before I even start, you can see the dark upside and the red tail, that contrast that pops right away. You can ID it. And this is just a video of a red tail on a thermal. And you see they're just kind of lazily circling and trying to gain altitude. So they have those nice broad wings and tail to catch that air. And when you play it again, you can see underneath, as soon as it turns, you can see those dark patagials, which is a giveaway right there to being a red-tailed hawk, along with the nice rufous tail. So yeah, when you see bootios, typically they're soaring, but if they are flapping, it looks more labored and it's more shallow. It's not as choppy as a flap, the flap glide as we talked about with the accipiters. And then we look at another boodio, which I wanted to talk about just because we've been seeing higher numbers of them this year, and that's the rough-legged hawk. And these guys, as many of you may or may not know, they breed up in the Arctic, and they come down, they winter in all across northern, the northern states, even into the central states and southern parts of some of the provinces in Canada. And this is another boodio. And the key ID features on these guys, in this first picture here, you can see the dark wrist patch. So they call it the carpal patch because it's like the wrist area. So you see these dark wrist patches. And then they also have, variable belly bands. And their tail is also a good giveaway because they have this dark subterminal band and then this big white base to the tail. So you'll see that in flight as opposed to red tails, which have either the rufous tail or the young ones that have the brown and barred tail. With rough legs, just like other bootios, there's a gradient of light morph to dark morph. So this picture over here on the right has a dark morph roughy. Some ways to key out a dark morph roughy is, once again, if you can get a good look at the tail, you're going to see that darker subterminal band with that white base, or depending on if it's an adult male or female, the amount of barring through it. And also roughies tend to have longer wings than red tails, so their wings actually appear straighter in flight. They look more long and tapered at the ends, which can be a good ID feature. Some behavior things, you a lot of times see these guys perched at the very tippy tops of trees. They like to sit up there and scan open areas. And a lot of times also you'll see them hover hunting in fields. Red tails do this too, but depending on the time of year, you can rule out if it's a roughy or red tail, and sometimes you're just gonna have to sit and watch. But a lot of times you'll see rough-legged hawks over an open field. They'll just be hovering with their wings just kind of fluttering, and that's them scanning for rodents in open areas. What's cool about roughies is there is sexual dimorphism. So a lot of raptors, you can't sex birds based on plumage because they look the exact same. With roughies, there is some sexual dimorphism, and if you get good looks, you're sometimes able to sex them. And the differences with those is the females usually have a more complete belly band, as opposed to this male here. The belly band is a lot more dispersed and it's more spotted. It's not as complete. as well as the tail. They always have that dark subterminal band, but the males seem to have more of this barring going through it as opposed to the females, which isn't as common. And also size. I mean, that's harder to tell in the field, but females are larger than males, just like I mentioned with other raptors. And then this is a cool picture down here, also from, guess again, our migration site, and it's a rough-tailed hawk and a common raven. So I just thought this was a cool picture because right away you can see that dark carpal wrist patch on the roughy. That's a giveaway that's rough-tailed hawk without seeing anything else, at least on the light morph birds. And it's just kind of cool to see the raven beside it. So these guys, right now, there seems to be a lot of them moving around, so it's a good time to get out and look for them. And now we've looked at the accipiters and bootios, we want to look at the falcons. And falcons, for the sake of this presentation, I just wanted to cover the American Kestrel. It's your most common falcon you're going to see. They inhabit, country or rural areas, so you usually see them on telephone wires or fence posts where they're hunting mice and other small rodents. They'll even take grasshoppers, small birds. So some quick, facts about falcons. They're built for being fast. They're streamlined, long pointed wings, narrow tapered tail. They're very fast. They're meant to chase things, and some falcons just in pure flight can reach up to 80 miles an hour. And things like the peregrine, which you see in cities hunting pigeons, when they're in a full stoop chasing stuff, they can, they've been clocked at reaching 200 miles per hour. So these birds are fast hunters. And I want to talk about kestrels because this is the one one species of falcon that actually, just like the roughies, exhibits sexual dimorphism. So if you see them, you can actually sex them based off of their plumage, with the females and males, females generally also being a little bit bigger, but the plumage is the giveaway for these guys. So the males, what they're characterized, they have an orange tail with a black band, which is pretty visible if the tail's fanned like that. That's a good giveaway. On the breast, it's normally on males kind of this whitish buffy with black spots. And then the adults, they still have, the buffy spots, but up near the chest, it's this pure orange bib. On the backside of the males, you have these blue upper wing coverts. And so it's this beautiful blue color, and it contrasts with their black feathers. So that's a good ID key, as opposed to the females over here, which on the upper side, their upper wing coverts are orange and black. And then their flight feathers are more just a lighter, not as black, with more of these buffy spots as opposed to the white spots on the males. Also, if you look at the tails, the female kestrels have an orange tail with black barring that goes all the way up. Males don't have that, and females' chests are streaky brown, so you can see that underneath flying. Another thing for kestrels too, just like roughies, sometimes you can see them hover hunting or hovering over stuff. They have really rapid wing beats. But for them, the main ID facts are the pointed wings, the narrow pointed tail, and the fast flight. And they also look very buoyant in flight, like it's very effortless. So sometimes that can be a good thing to key in on with these guys. And these guys are also migrating through, and we don't see as many high numbers of them, but this is one of the more common falcons that you're most likely going to see if you're out looking for them. And then we want to get into the eagles. So the biggest group of raptors that we observe here in Mackinac and in North America. So I first wanted to focus on the bald eagle because they've seen, they've had a great recovery, and there are a lot of bald eagles around generally, and they're not too easy. They're pretty easy to spot if you see them just because of how big they are. So some of the key features for bald eagles is being so big. They obviously, when they're flying, it appears very labored and lazy just because of how big they are. And eagles can also be tough to ID just because of their multiple plumages. So it takes a bald eagle and a golden eagle 4 or 5 years before they reach their definitive adult plumage. So there's juvenile birds, and then there's all sorts of subadult morphs, which can be very tricky to age. So we're going to go through some of these different things you can try to separate at least juvenile, subadult, and adult bald eagle when you see them. So starting with juvenile bald eagles, which is up here, one of the things you're going to notice is they have a dark belly, which can be mixed with some white, and then they have a lot of white in their underwing coverts and their axillaries, and they're very dark overall and two-tone. So if you see them from the top side, you're going to see a contrast with the brownish back and black flight feathers. As well, just like with a lot of other juvenile raptors, the secondaries on the bird are very stocky. So the wings on younger bald eagles seem a lot broader than adults, which the secondaries are a lot smaller. Some other good ID features for juvenile bald eagles, especially in the fall, these inner secondaries right here have these white bases to them. So it kind of looks like there's a gap of feathers missing there. So that's a good ID feature for a young bald eagle. But overall for young ones, very dark. They have the two-tone contrast on the back if you see them dorsally, and then they have a variable amount of white in the belly and in the axillaries. And also compared to a golden eagle, bald eagles have a bigger head. So when you see them flying, their head sticks out a lot more because they have a bigger bill. So that can be a good ID feature. As for the tail, young bald eagles, they kind of have this smudgy tip at the base, and the rest is white. And then as you move into the subadult 1, 2, and 3 bald eagles, that's where you start to see a lot of variation. So in the fall, if you see a bald eagle that looks like it has irregularities in its feathers or it's molting, automatically you can rule out that it's not a juvenile bird. Juvenile birds will not molt in the fall. They won't molt till the previous spring. So anytime you see any sort of molt going on or gaps in the feathers, you can at least assure yourself that you're looking at some sort of an adult. So as we get into the subadults of the bald eagles here in the middle, what you're kind of seeing is you'll see discrepancies in the secondaries a lot of times. So you'll see the shorter subadult secondaries with the retained juvenile secondaries. And then as you get to the older birds where they have their definitive secondaries, definitive adult secondaries with subadult secondaries, you'll just see the contrasts in color. Also, as these birds get older, their head starts to transition to white. So this bird is probably a subadult 3 or 4 because it's got a very white head. It's almost got that characteristic cracking white head, but it's still got some smudging throughout the eye line. And then in the tail, same kind of thing. Unless it's spread, it's hard to see the different generations in the tail. But once again, you kind of have that dark tail band with the white base, which seems smudged, and as they get older and reach definitive adult plumage, they'll have a pure white tail. And then at about 4 or 5 years of age, you have, which is most recognizable to everybody, is your adult bald eagle. White in head, you know, they really contrast with the body. You can see the wings are all uniform. They're all adult feathers. And sometimes, depending on the background or the lighting, when you see an adult bald eagle flying like this, sometimes you won't even see the head or the tail because they're so white. You'll just see the dark body, which is a good thing to key in on. And then a lot of times too, sometimes you'll see an adult like this and you'll see like a dark smudge on the tail. And that just can be because they sit on the ground and they get mud on their tail. So a lot of times don't get confused with these younger tails where they have the white and the dark smudging on the adults, because sometimes their tail is just dirty from where they're sitting or what they've been in. So once again, eagles, a lot of plumage morphs. They take 4 or 5 years to reach adulthood. And hopefully some of these tricks will help you guys to be able to discern juvenile, the different subadults, and then the adult. And then if we flip on the contrary to the other eagle species we see is the golden eagle. And golden eagles, as a general rule, are more likely going to be seen in the west and the east. They do migrate in the east, but they're more uncommonly seen. Golden eagles are characterized by being mostly dark with a golden nape. So the back of their head, as their name suggests, is this goldish color. Um, and golden eagles are a lot harder to micro-age when flying. It's, the transition from juvenile to adult, once again, just like the bald eagle, takes 4 or 5 years. Um, but the differences are a lot harder to see just because of the plumage, how similar the subadult feathers to the adult feathers are. Um, but just like bald eagles, you're going to see long, broad wings, kind of this more lazier flight just because of how big they are. The difference with the bald eagle is, as you saw, the wings were really broad and stocky. If you look here on this bird here on the left, there's kind of a gradient as the secondaries go in, it tapers, so it makes the inside of the wing look a little bit thinner, and this just takes practice seeing. So that's a good characteristic. And same with the outside of the primaries here, like the hands. They look more tapered. They're not as rounded and as broad as a bald eagle. Looking at juvenile bald eagles, which can be pretty easily spotted based on the lighting, you're always going to see this dark base to the tail with this big white patch evenly throughout. And then you're going to see this white wing patch, which is highly variable, but is always going to be seen on young birds. So if you see those two things, chances are it's a juvenile eagle. Some of the subadult eagles will replace feathers that may break up this white wing patch, so it might confuse you. But if you get a good look and it looks all uniform and there's no molt going on, it's you can pretty much guarantee that you're looking at a young golden eagle. And the same thing with the other, just like bald eagle, as these birds start to become subadults, they start to replace secondaries, and their adult or subadult secondaries are shorter. So you'll see on birds that aren't quite a full adult or quite a juvenile, you'll see these size differences within the secondaries as they mature. And then your definitive adult over here on the right, what you can see is kind of just an overall really dark bird. There's no white wing patches, no big white patch in the tail. And the adult tail feathers and subadult tail feathers on golden eagles, they lose that white and they get the dark tip still, but they have these grayish wavy bands, which sometimes you can see based on the lighting, and those are adult feathers, which gives them that overall dark appearance. And as it says here, the tail is a great indicator to help age goldens. But when it's folded and you can't see those mixed generations of juvenile or subadult or adult feathers, it's almost impossible to age them because they're flight feathers. It's too hard to tell. So the way to best to break it down is between juvenile and adult. The juvenile have your white wing patches, which are variable, the dark band in the tail with the big white even base going across. And then you have your adults with the dark tail subterminal band, but they also have grayish wavy bands going throughout it, and then the overall dark bird. And then also, if you ever see goldens and bald eagles beside each other, golden eagles appear to have a smaller head. It doesn't stick out as much because their bill isn't as big. So sometimes, depending on the angle you're viewing the bird at, that can be a good ID feature to key in on. And these guys right now are moving through pretty good here. So this is a good time to see them as they're migrating north to their breeding grounds. And then the last bird I wanted to focus on is the turkey vulture. Turkey vultures are very commonly seen at hawk watch sites and commonly seen in general. And some of the good ID features for these guys is their strong dihedral. So a dihedral is the angle that's formed between their wings. So turkey vultures, the angle between their wings is always really held high. So it kind of looks like a V. And apart from that, their flight is very buoyant. So they look very effortless, like they're just kind of floating around, but they're also teetering. So they always look like they're off balance, which you can see they kind of tip side to side, back and forth. So once you see that strong angle in the wings and that teetering behavior, that's a good giveaway for it being a vulture, a turkey vulture. And also their outer primaries here, they're very distended. They look like fingers. They're not like other hawks where they're more rounded or tapered and closer together. These kind of project more. And the big thing too with seeing these guys is the contrast between the flight feathers and the body and underwing coverts. So underneath, based on the lighting, the flight feathers appear very silverish, as you can see, and then the body's really dark. So that contrast really, when you see them, it really pops. And right away, that is one good feature, that with their teetering, their dihedral, and then their small little head. their head, in flight almost looks non-existent. So one of the easier birds to ID when you're first at a hawk watch site, because they have a lot of really distinguishable behaviors and features. And they also will usually be in big groups kettling together. So you'll see them teetering and soaring and gaining altitude together in big groups like that video I showed you at the beginning. As for aging these guys, if you ever see them up close, turkey vultures, when they're young, they have dark heads. So their heads are naked because they stick their heads in all sorts of carcasses because they're scavengers. So as young birds, you'll see more of a dark head with a darker bill. As they age, their head turns red, as you can see here, and their bill turns more white. And then you have kind of intermediates where the head is transitioning to that red and the bill is light, but it's still got a dark tip. So if you see a red head and a white bill on a turkey vulture, it's an adult. If you see a more blackish head with a darker bill, it's a younger turkey vulture. And yeah, these guys are one of the easiest birds that you're going to be able to ID in flight. So just remember the contrast, behavior, and where they're found. So they're scavenging. You can see them. They have a very wide range, and sometimes you'll even see them mixed in with other raptors as well. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys all for tuning into this presentation. Hopefully you guys learned some stuff, and next time you're out in the field, you'll be able to take some of these tips and tricks and ID hawks. And just remember, it all takes practice to get better. So it's just one of those things, you got to get out there and do it. With that, I'd like to thank you all again and thank the Michigan State University Science Festival for allowing me to present.